Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the Fall 2025 virtual CCPO-ICAR seminar series. I am very pleased to welcome Dr. Ashley Ross from Texas A&M University at Galveston, who will be giving a presentation today. Thank you all for joining. And Dr. Ross' presentation is titled Capacity and Community, Exploring the Complexities of Disaster Recovery Through the Lens of HUD CDBG-DR Funding. Dr. Ashley Ross is an associate professor at Texas A&M University's College of Marine Sciences and Maritime Studies in Galveston, Texas. Her research focuses on the governance of coastal environmental hazards, and she has published over 30 articles and 2 books on community resilience to disasters, emergency management, risk communication, and individual factors associated with public policy support related to environmental and disaster issues. Welcome, Dr. Ross, and go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here and was just thrilled to be asked to be part of your seminar series. We have our own in my college, and I think it's just such a great way to share our work and to collaborate with a wider audience. So thank you for being here and thank you for inviting me. I know the title of my presentation is a mouthful, but we're going to break it down and hopefully have a great discussion about this topic. I'm excited to share it because it is part of the center that I serve as an associate director for, which is the Department of Housing and Urban Development's Center of Excellence in Capacity Building for Resilient Housing. And it's, as you'll see, still very much a work in progress, but something that's exciting and I think highly relevant for right now. So I want to begin, though, before getting into the specifics of this research, of reflecting a bit on my hometown now of Galveston. And it seems rather appropriate because today is actually the 125th anniversary of the 1900 hurricane or storm that devastated the island and was highly influential in how it rebuilt and how it informed coastal mitigation and measures of risk reduction across our Gulf Coast. And while I'm not going to be talking about that disaster, I am excited to begin with a bit of a story about Galveston. And this is the beautiful island. We do indeed have some gorgeous water thanks to warm oceans, and it's a great place to live and work. But I want to tell you a story about Hurricane Ike that happened and a couple decades ago. Hurricane Ike was a very large storm, as you can see from the satellite image, and it actually struck Galveston Island, made landfall near the island on September 13th, 2008 as a Category 2 storm. At the time, it was the second or third costliest disaster. And I want to step through a story of recovery to Hurricane Ike with all of you today to begin thinking about these issues of capacity and community and focusing on housing, because housing is one of those critical needs to bring communities back following disasters and to ensure that they're thriving. So you'll see this timeline I'm walking through today is from 2008 until about the present. And I want to highlight a few things about this to set up how we look at this research. So Hurricane Ike, as I mentioned, made landfall on September 13th of 2008. It was a Category 2 storm. It had storm surges up to 15 feet on Galveston Island, even higher on Bolivar Peninsula. And those storm surges reached 15 to 18 miles inland. At the time, the largest state's search and rescue effort was underway because there were individuals that had to be rescued off the island and other places inundated with water and wind. There was a total of 113 deaths in the US, and the total damage of the storm was $38 billion, which at the time placed it at about second or third costliest storm in history. It created major disruptions to utilities and infrastructure. And importantly, for this consideration of housing recovery, it damaged 75% of residential structures on Galveston Island. And as we look at how the island itself recovered housing, it was really slow. Reports from the Texas Observer noted that in 2013, only 41% of damaged homes had been rebuilt or rehabilitated, even though it was 5 years after the storm. Even up to 2015, we see that there were efforts to clear abandoned homes out of the way. In fact, the city used $1.5 million in disaster recovery money to tear down 120 abandoned homes, and they did that so that they could clear those properties for reconstruction. In addition to owner-occupied homes, there was a lot of issues and slow recovery with affordable housing units. And what we saw is very slow recovery of housing unit development. Many of them were torn down and new mixed-use developments put in their place. And we had new developments constructed in 2016, 2017, and even the most recent one was just last year in 2024. What's interesting about this, though, is that it didn't fully replace the affordable housing units that were in place before pre-ICE. And so only about 64% of the number of pre-ICE affordable housing units have been restored. And if you look at recent market data, you can see that the housing stock on the island is back to about pre-ICE levels, and the population isn't lagging all that much. And what we know is that includes the most recent development of affordable housing that boosted the affordable housing units by over 250. So there's about 34,000 residential homes on the island now, and it's been a long road of recovery for the island. And I would just want to take a moment to point out some of the capacity issues that existed across this recovery timeline, beginning at the beginning and thinking about how funds were injected for recovery and housing specifically. So once the hurricane actually hit, within 3 months, the federal government had approved $465 million to Galveston County, and that included things like shelter and medical needs, hotels, housing repairs for individuals, but also debris removal and utility restoration and building repairs for local governments. When we move into 2010, we see that there's a disbursement of $267 million to the city of Galveston from HUD for housing, rehab and reconstruction, and for infrastructure, including water lines, wastewater treatment, and street repairs. In 2013, we have this time period where there's additional funding dispersed from HUD to the city of Galveston again for the rehab and reconstruction of 300 homes and continued infrastructure repairs to utilities, streets, and public facilities. Now, when we talked about the demolished, damaged homes, those funds were actually diverted from a housing assistance program to demolish homes because those funds had to be used by 2016. And then when we move into this last time period all the way into today, we can see that we're still in recovery and that Galveston has gotten an additional disbursement of $15 million from HUD for the rehab and reconstruction of existing affordable housing units that aren't the new developments, and then for drainage improvements at the new developments. And so continued housing recovery up into, it's still ongoing right now. And so we can walk away from this story of my hometown, and probably we're coming to the same conclusions of thinking that, wow, this is a really slow pace. 18 years and still going, even though the first housing assistance was dispersed and in the hands of the state and then the local government 3 months following the disaster. The other thing that we might notice is that there are some inefficiencies going on. There seems to be this last-ditch use of some grant funds, so reallocation or redirection of funding from housing assistance programs to demolition was the example we saw in Galveston. And also a reallocation of federal funds. So that 2025 reallocation or funding from HUD is actually a reallocation of funds that have been recaptured because they weren't spent during Hurricane Ike recovery and some of them during Hurricane Harvey recovery. And so a lot of inefficiencies also going on. And then finally, some inequities. If we put ourselves in the shoes of individuals who live here on the island during Hurricane Ike, we can imagine that if we were a renter and a low income family, we would have been displaced. And indeed, that was the case and has been the case for many. Even those who are homeowners, a lot of them were overburdened in the low and moderate income category with housing repairs. And so those inequities are ones that we see in other places. These inefficiencies and slow pace is also endemic to housing recovery in general, despite the massive amounts of federal dollars that are being invested in it. And so the research center that I am part of is looking to better understand capacity for recovery. We want to explore what capacities are needed for disaster recovery in general and housing recovery specifically, and then also how those housing recovery outcomes vary by state and local government capacity. And this is in an effort to come up with recommendations that can be targeted to improving these processes and institutions, policies, and programs, and ultimately the outcomes for families affected by disasters. And so we are conducting the study of government capacity and housing recovery in a few different cases. We're focused on Texas and California. We're looking at the time period of about 2017 to 2018. We've chosen that because it seems like a good amount of time to have seen some progress in recovery and use and implementation of funds. And we are also focusing on wildfires, hurricanes, and floods. So in California, we're looking at the Tubbs fire that occurred in 2017, primarily affecting Santa Rosa and Sonoma County, and the Camp Fire in 2018, affecting Paradise and Butte County. In Texas, we are looking at Hurricane Harvey, which we'll unpack in a moment and see that it affected over 50 counties across the state. But we are also looking in particular at the city of Houston, and that region of Texas in terms of housing recovery from Hurricane Harvey. And then finally, we're looking at some flooding that happened in South Texas in 2018 that affected counties in the lower Rio Grande Valley, specifically Hidalgo and Cameron counties, among others. So in understanding capacity issues, as you saw, one of our first questions is how should we even approach this issue of government capacity? And then move into measuring it and analyzing it. We've conducted a literature review that we're still finalizing, looking at different components of government capacity for disaster recovery and housing recovery specifically. And what we're finding is that there's different buckets of capacity that aligns with what we already know about organizational capacity, but becomes really important in this context. And so we see that financial resources are important in terms of providing the revenue and the needed streams of funds for government functions and recovery. And what we know from the research is that financial resources can enable more equitable service delivery and faster, more inclusive housing recovery, but it doesn't mean that alone it can accomplish that. So we're also looking at technical resources as critical component of capacity. This refers to the government's access to data and tools and knowledge and expertise for informed planning and recovery. This becomes particularly important for things like housing assessments and how localities are approaching damages and estimating those damages, and then moving forward with efforts to rebuild and their communities. It also involves human or administrative resources, so the presence of expert staff, leadership, and sound organizational infrastructure. And this becomes incredibly important for carrying out recovery tasks that are incredibly complex. Also for adaptive learning to occur as recovery unfolds and implementation evolves, and coordinating among agencies and different levels of government to make sure that there's smooth processes and that the pace of recovery isn't slowed. That lends itself also to the next component, which is intergovernmental relations. So specifically that collaboration between local, state, and federal entities, and how important that is for sharing resources and policy alignment and making coordinated efforts for housing recovery. Civic engagement is another component of capacity that's critical in this context, because it's about the government's ability to build trust and relationships with the public for policy support. And we know that it can enhance the legitimacy of housing recovery programs and facilitate more inclusive housing recovery and disaster recovery by engaging a broader audience and public. And it also can empower vulnerable groups that are often left out of recovery when they trust government and when they are more fully engaged. Government autonomy is also important because these units need to be able to make decisions independently and manage resources without too much external control. So if we want recovery to be timely and not slow, we do need to have localities that can spend money and that can implement programs and policies that they design. And then leadership also has been pointed to in the literature as important for strategic decision making and recovery efforts. So really having a coordinated vision for what recovery looks like and how housing recovery will be achieved. So we are looking at government capacity in that regard, and we are also understanding part of its the capacity in terms of financial and physical resources in relation to federal funding for disaster recovery. Now, there are many different pots of funding for disaster recovery from the federal government. That includes FEMA and their public assistance grants, as well as individual assistance grants that go to households, as well as the hazard mitigation grant program that is really for reducing future disaster risk. We also know that funds flow through Economic Development Administration and their disaster grants that are geared specifically at revitalizing local economies, infrastructure, workforce, business support. The Small Business Administration is a critical funding source for recovery in the low interest loans that they give homeowners, renters, and businesses to repair or replace property. And the U.S. Department of Agriculture also is critical for rural communities in supporting housing, utility, and facility repairs and reconstruction. And then there's also the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and they have a program called the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery, or CDBG-DR, and it provides long-term recovery funding for housing, infrastructure, planning, and economic development. And the focus of our center is on understanding and unpacking CDBG-DR, and specifically as a source of funding for state and local governments, and a critical funding source for housing in particular. So, like many other sources of funding, there's particular processes tailored just to that, that funding source, and they have different cycles. This is from the Congressional Research Service report on, I'm just going to call it DR funding, and shows how it unfolds. So it has to begin with a congressional appropriation and a HUD rulemaking and allocations following that appropriation. Then the communities who have been affected by the disaster get involved by developing action plans. HUD then approves those, and communities are disperse the funds to implement those programs. Throughout it, HUD monitors things and Congress has oversight. Now, while that seems fairly straightforward on this figure, it's a bit messier in reality. And I want to give you some ideas of what we're talking about. To be eligible for funding and to receive funds from DR, states have to submit action plans. These action plans are detailed documents that include all of the things you're seeing on the screen: an unmet needs assessment, a method of distribution, a program budget and description of use of funds, then the specific program descriptions and implementation plan. They detail financial controls and procurement. They also look at how and outline how citizen participation and public commentary is gathered, and then performance metrics and reporting. And so these action plans become these huge documents that are outlining recovery, typically for large areas. So what we'll see in a moment with Hurricane Harvey is it was most of the southeastern part of the state. And the same with the state of California. Typically, these are for buckets of disasters that happen within a year or two of one another. And so they're these massive plans to roll out programs for recovery. They have to include data that they derive from other agencies, including the Small Business Association as well as FEMA, in order to demonstrate that there are indeed unmet needs in the disaster recovery space. And so that unmet needs is really critical because this DR funding becomes kind of the last resort for recovery. It's rolled out and after FEMA has responded, after the Small Business Association has provided loans, and after insurance and other private entities have paid out. And so it's looking to fill in the gaps of what's left for recovery, for housing in particular, and then also infrastructure. Now, when we're looking at these state plans and understanding DR funding, low and moderate income becomes a really important piece of it. It's absolutely central to how HUD DR funds are distributed and used. It can really be considered the backbone of it. And it's not just a guideline, it's a statutory requirement that shapes the program's design, selection, and reporting. So at least 70% of DR funds have to be shown to benefit low and moderate income persons. And what that means is that the action plan itself must show how programs meet this objective, either directly or through area-based benefits. Directly meaning assistance funneled directly to households or families. Now, what you're seeing on this map on this slide is just a depiction of the city of Houston in terms of its low and moderate income neighborhoods, with the red being 80% or more, the orange 60 to 80, and the yellow 40 to 60, and then green and blue under that. So the 70% mark is looking at DR funds benefiting LMI communities and neighborhoods. And so for the city of Houston, that's really concentrated in its center and then on some of the fringes. Infrastructure projects in particular have to show that they serve LMI areas or directly benefit LMI populations. So an LMI area is defined as a community where more than or equal to 51% of the residents are low to moderate income. We also see that areas with higher concentrations of LMI are often receiving larger shares of funding. And the grantees must track and report on LMI benefit. It becomes critical, and if it's not done correctly, can result in rescinding the funds or court cases. There's multiple types of benefits tied to this, so it's important to understand that they can go directly to individuals, these funds can, for things like housing repairs, or it can go to an area where it's benefiting an entire community where the residents are predominantly LMI, or it can go to targeted specific LMI services and groups, like for example, to seniors. So all of that has to be accounted for when communities develop their action plans before HUD funds are obligated and then expended. And we can see that what this means, and as I detailed a moment ago, DR becomes this last resort of funding, and you can see the lag between disasters and the DR allocations in this graph. So what we have here, the gray background is the cost of billion-dollar disasters in billions of dollars from NOAA. And then we have in the red bars, the DR allocations in millions of dollars plotted across the same timeline. And what we see is when there's these peaks of disaster damages, indicating that major disasters have occurred, ones that cost billions of dollars, it's usually the next year or two where we're then seeing allocations being approved by Congress for this DR funding. So all of this is a bit lagged in the way that recovery funding is flowing. And that's an important piece of it to understand how government capacity unfolds for housing recovery. So going back to government capacity itself, we've talked about theoretically what some of the buckets or components of it should be. Um, and we have an idea of how we'd like to translate that into a capacity index where we're looking at resources that include human and financial resources, using budget reports and audits as a source of that data and information. We're also looking at the abilities or expertise of the staff, measuring that in terms of procurement timelines and days and staff expertise in terms of the certification that they have completed and the years of experience that they have. And also in terms of the readiness of that locality for implementing DR funds. Here we're interested in intergovernmental collaboration measured by memorandums of understanding, as well as administrative data, and then oversight mechanisms that they have outlined in their state action plans. And so all of this is getting at implementation capacity to use those DR funds efficiently and effectively for their intended purposes. Now, in measuring housing recovery, you might have noticed in the timeline of Galveston's recovery, I got a bit vague towards the end where I said, well, and the housing units look like they've returned to pre-ICE levels. Well, that is because housing recovery data and measuring housing recovery can be quite complicated and difficult. Um, for one, in concept, understanding what housing recovery is can be multifaceted. So does it mean recovery for one individual family? Does it mean that they're moving back into the home that was damaged? Or does it mean that they're living somewhere else, functioning again, resuming their normal day-to-day lives? And does that count as recovery? Or is recovery not a household level, but a community level phenomenon where we need to be understanding how utilities are restored and homes are kind of back on the grid? There's not really a consensus in the literature on it, but it's one of those things where we look at it in a multitude of ways and kind of triangulate where we're getting with understanding recovery processes. So what we are proposing to do in our study is to measure housing recovery through rehousing rates, which is the percentage of displaced residents who return to permanent housing, including owner-occupied and rental housing. We also will be looking at construction completion rates. So you can look at the proportion of planned housing units that are new builds or rehabs that are completed and certified as habitable. And then also looking at reduction in resident displacement. So looking at how residents are remaining in or returning to their pre-disaster neighborhoods and homes. And so these are some ways that we will be measuring housing recovery. And we will be paying attention to it in terms of equity. So looking at disparities in these different rates across racial and ethnic groups, income, housing type, meaning is it owner occupied or a rental, and also vulnerability of the community. And we're also interested in understanding this in terms of efficiency. So looking at the percentage of DR funds that are dispersed to an intended housing program versus reallocated to others. And all of these things we think will really help us understand housing recovery and pinpoint how housing recovery is influenced by government capacity and the ways that we're measuring it. So as I mentioned, this is a research that's in progress, and I want to show you some of the preliminary findings related specifically to looking at efficiency in recovery. So this is going to be data for Hurricane Harvey. Hurricane Harvey hit Texas in 2017 and meandered across the state and didn't leave it until August 30th. It was a Category 4 hurricane at landfall in kind of the south of the coast at Rockport, and then it stalled over southeast Texas for days, dumping up to 60 inches of rain in some areas, causing catastrophic flooding in surrounding areas of Houston, as well as Houston itself, affecting over 200,000 homes in Harris County alone, and causing $125 billion in damages, making it the second costliest disaster in U.S. history after Katrina. So in terms of the DR funds, the event itself happened in August. What we see and what happened in the state of Texas is the General Land Office immediately within a week contacted Congress and the White House and asked for existing DR funds that are left over to be allocated to Texas for immediate response and recovery. And so Texas gets from the get-go $57 million in HUD funds. And then we start seeing some of the action plans and other allocations rolling out. So Congress is then approving money, not just for Texas, but for the slew of hurricanes that happened in the very active 2017 hurricane season. We see HUD allocating $5 billion of that to Texas. The Texas General Land Office, or GLO, is who is overseeing DR funds in the state. They are developing and then submitting an action plan. HUD's reviewing it and approving it. And then we also see that in this case, it's not just the state as a grantee, but there's sub-grantees locally. The city of Houston and Harris County made the case that because they were so affected by the heavy rainfall caused by the hurricane, that they wanted to administer their own grants from HUD for recovery. And so those local plans then were submitted as amendments, and a homeowner assistance program was launched finally by December 2018. So again, this is over a year later after the event that these funds are actually being put into a program that's launched. More launching of programs in 2019 with amendments approved for those localities to run their own programs of homeowner assistance and buyouts. Again, more amendments are being passed in 2019 to clarify programs. We also see in 2020 and 2021, as these DR funds are being used and programs rolled out, some reform to their usage. And so amendments are then submitted to be approved by HUD that reallocate some funding and revamp different programs. So using the funds in different ways. What happened at this point in Texas in 2020 was that the Texas General Land Office, who was the grantee on the state level and administering HUD funds, saw that the city of Houston and Harris County were not spending down their grants very efficiently, and they weren't getting homeowners into the programs that they had created. And so with Amendment 7, the GLO took those local programs from Harris County and the city of Houston and replaced them with state-run programs. Now, in subsequent amendments 8 and 9 in March and November of the following year, 2021, they reinstated some of that funding to the county and the city of Houston for some of their local programs. But overall, it became state-run at that point. And then we see continued adjustments happening from 2022 to 2024, different amendments to clarify different programs and responsibilities, and HUD actually granting a 2-year extension for the funding in 2024. And then they hit the milestone of about 2,000 homes completed in Harris County, and this is meaning rebuilt. And the city of Houston and Southeast Texas finally having all of the homes that were planned to be rebuilt there completed. But as of today, we know that the city of Houston still hasn't completely allocated its funding, and that there are still individuals that are recovering from Hurricane Harvey despite this massive investment of funds. And so to understand this a bit more, my colleagues and I have plotted how Hurricane Harvey DR allocations have changed and what they look like as those programs evolve. And so this is that initial 57.8 million allocation that was made right after the event happened. And this is quite small compared to what's to come with the $5 billion allocation that's made in the following year. But you can see how this starts to get parceled out. There's this allocation made, and residential buyout programs became a big part of that. So moving people away from risk became a high priority. We also see that we have some programs rolled out for rental recovery and helping individuals that are not homeowners. And then if you look at these APAs, that stands for amendments, action plan amendments. And we see that there's some different structuring going on. So this PREPS program wasn't really taking off. So they reallocated that funds into a buyout program, voluntary and mandatory. And then still some of those funds were reallocated to rental programs as those buyout programs didn't have as much uptake as they expected. Now, when we move into the larger allocation, it gets quite more complicated, and I'm going to spare us all going through it. What you're seeing, though, is a messy graph because of the number of amendments that have occurred. But I want us to just kind of scale back for a minute and think about some of the bigger takeaways here. The first is that there's an evolution of recovery happening across this DR funding. With 17 action plan amendments, you can see that the budget was significantly rebalanced to adjust to evolving needs, stakeholder input, and program performance. So where programs were underfunding or underperforming, those funds were reallocated. We also know that there was some strategic shifts, specifically with that underperformance. So the GLO reallocated unused or underutilized funds, moving things from homeowner programs to renter programs. And then we also know that there's some capacity issues going on. $1 billion wasn't used by the city of Houston, and the GLO had to take over housing programs from the city of Houston and Harris County in 2020. And so all of this paints a very complex picture that requires a better understanding of capacity in this context. In addition to looking at expenditure data, we've been conducting interviews with DR grantees for these 2017 and 2018 events in California and Texas. And we've conducted about 10 interviews so far with state and local officials, focused on capturing the process experience and outcomes. And findings from these interviews right now is that the DR process overall is slow. And it's not just about the slow implementation, but it is slow to actually qualify and get the funds. So those action plan requirements are burdensome. Um, Another piece of it is that the administration of DR funds, when it goes to grantees and then to sub-grantees, meaning localities, capacity on the county and city government level varies considerably for implementation. Some places and governments, local governments, are ready to go and able to do it, and others are not. There's also inconsistent rules and processes because DR is disaster specific and Congress is allocating it for each event and HUD is making rules for each event. And that becomes also burdensome in terms of the administration of these funds. Finally, there's inequities across communities. In South Texas, this picture is showing a woman standing in floodwaters in colonias. Well, colonias are unincorporated communities within the region, and they often don't qualify for any type of funding. So that's one type of inequity that exists. And then there are others based on income and race and ethnicity. So in terms of our next steps, we are interested and will continue to conduct interviews, build out a government capacity data set with housing recovery outcomes, and then analyze these things through mixed methods and land at a place where we can make some evidence-based recommendations for policy and program designs. Some key takeaways for us more broadly than the DR funding is that when we look at the way disaster recovery is structured in our country, we can see that it fundamentally relies on household and community capacity. So it favors households with resources. The households that are the quickest to rebuild are those that have insurance, those that can take time off of work, those that can leverage family and resources and savings to make repairs. Individuals and families that are left behind are those that are renters or low income. We also know that those recovery outcomes vary by government capacity and that some communities are left behind because their government's, local government's capacity just didn't enable them to recover. And so where this capacity is lacking on the household and community level, we see inequities emerge and persist. And I think another takeaway is that we need to rethink our approach to disasters in our country. We lack a codified disaster recovery fund. So this CDBG-DR has to be allocated by Congress for every year, every event. And that hinders recovery because it slows it down, it makes it political, and it means that systems and processes and rules are not standardized. We also need a forward-looking orientation to mitigate disaster risk. So it's not just about rebuilding to past standards. And then finally, thinking about more efficient mechanisms to help low and moderate income households earlier in the disaster recovery process. So it's completely unacceptable, in my informed opinion, that subsidized housing renters would have to wait to 2024 in the city of Galveston to have a housing unit available, 18 years after a disaster. Certainly, the majority of them have moved on and created lives other places. And what this does is destroy the fabric of communities and creates incredible resilience obstacles for those families in the long run. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to any questions you might have.